this is Dan. And once again, let's talk about some of the things that are going on in the entertainment industry and where I feel certain opportunities are going to be coming online sooner rather than later. But let's start with something that doesn't sound like it's related, but it actually is. It's very, very related indeed. Cameron Pasha, who runs a Patreon page that goes over many of the things that are happening in the entertainment industry from his position as a well-respected industry writer with many shows to his credit, talked about one of the things that he has noticed. And that is that a great deal of the content that was showing up on many of the premium cable system, particularly Amazon Prime and of course Netflix, is a lot of other programming from the Anglosphere. And what do I mean by the rest of the Anglosphere? I don't just mean Canada, because certainly we have enough runaway productions that are being shot there, but a lot of things are being lensed in Great Britain. And not all of them are Game of Thrones type big epics. Some of them are very much of the old school bonnets and carriages type shows, such as Bridgerton, but also Baby Reindeer, which was very much a UK only show that happened to connect with people because it captured the emotional context so well that it was able to, quote unquote, cross the pond and work in the United States. Other programs include Fool Me Once and The Gentleman. But it's not only the Anglosphere. Look at the number of people who are actually watching shows from out of the United States. Now, the numbers are still very small percentage-wise relative to the overwhelming amount of American-based projects. But there is definitely an interest in K-dramas, in some J-horror, as well as J-dramas, old school J-dramas, and things that are coming from other countries. I have to say that one of my favorite shows, even though there's not that many episodes of it, is Call My Agent. Call My Agent is a French show, and it's all about the goings-on at a talent agency in France, in Paris, that is suspiciously similar to the way talent agencies used to be run in the United States, but really aren't anymore. So it was kind of a throwback because France never ran their talent agencies this way. So it's kind of an homage to Hollywood while not being one. It also featured many, many French stars from the past, many of whom I first experienced watching French movies with Japanese subtitles when I was growing up in Japan, not understanding either language fully. It was a very interesting way to experience a lot of movies, but it was very helpful because you really learn what some of the language of the visuals can be by trying to understand something that you don't really have a good grasp of what is being said. Anyway, one of the things that I think Hollywood is missing is they're looking at these British shows and are not trying to understand why they are popular. And instead, they're trying to think, how can we take this concept or things that are like it and feed it in to the US mill and grind it up in a US type format? And while that kind of sort of makes sense, what they're thinking is they're not thinking of embracing the parts of those shows that make them distinctly different from their American counterparts. And what are the things that make them distinctly different? Well, first of all of these shows have predominantly British crews. And unlike the early days of runaway production, which was the 90s, when everything was running away to Canada and all of that because of Cavco and the production incentives. And what there was a lack of understanding was that when you go and shoot something in Canada, you are dealing with a completely different aesthetic than what you would have in Hollywood. For example, the framing of most shows was different because Canadian film production, the students who eventually became the Canadian cinematographers and were the ones that the Americans would hire, were based on an education that was far more European, far more use of medium shots, two shots that would go on for a long time, rather than going through the American method of starting wide, coming closer, and then doing over the shoulder shots and close ups and all of that. And the reason for that was because these filmmakers didn't have the money to shoot the kind of coverage that American movies had. So they felt different. And at the time, you had many American producers, notice the producers, not the below the line crews, that were saying, well, it's not a problem. We just go in there and tell them how to shoot it differently. And it doesn't work that way, because if you're an artist and if you're used to shooting something with a certain color palette, with a certain lighting scheme, with a certain aesthetic, and then someone tells you, well, we need you to shoot it this way, it's not like you take a 2-week course and it becomes natural to you. No, it's almost like you're learning a whole different language, because you, in fact, are. You're learning a whole different means of production, because the footage is going to be used differently in post-production, because the editors are also going to be used to letting shots run longer. They're also going to not be so quick to try to capture the reaction emotion, which is the hallmark of US style editing. You'll notice whenever someone starts on a speech, very seldom do they finish it. In the middle of what they're talking about, you cut to the person on the other side. And the reason you do that is because the person on the other side is giving you the reaction. And that's where the story comes from. On stage, it's about the dialogue. In movies, it's about the reaction, because that reaction tells the audience how they should be feeling. But if you were trained in the European system, which allowed for longer takes, where the audience was going to be watching and trying to see what the meaning was while looking at the much more static composition that wasn't quite as close. And to tell a cinematographer, well, just learn it this way, that means they're still going to frame it natively a little bit differently. And yes, you after a while they'll get it, and they'll understand what a US close-up is as opposed to a European style or an Asian style close-up, but it's still different. And it was sufficiently different enough to where movies of the week, which used to be a major part of a network structure, all ran away to Canada in the mid-90s. And within 2 to 3 years, they stopped making them because the movies didn't look right. And it's not just because all the supporting players had to barely suppress a slightly Canadian accent, but the light looked different. Canadian light doesn't look the same as Southern California light. So if you're shooting exteriors, all of the colors are subtly shifted. If you're doing production design, your sensibility is more of a European color palette. The US color palette at that time was far more aggressive, and because it was in the earlier days of a little bit of higher quality televisions, laughable compared to what would come with digital and 4K and all of that. But still, it had been an improvement. And so American producers were trying to show the greater fidelity that the cathode ray tube TVs were able to get at the time. And here we're starting to bring things in from Canada that looked rather drab and rather like a 70s movie. Not a bad thing necessarily, except that Americans were at that time used to the look of the Miami Vices and the X-Files, which admittedly was shot in Canada, but that was because they were looking for that slightly different sense. And Moonlighting and all these other shows that had a high level of bling and a high level of blue skies and primary colors and all of that. Okay, yeah, you had a period when everything was too blue. NYPD Blue, Homicide: Life on the Street. All of these shows tended to have a blue bias or a very brown bias. But while the Canadian ones tended to be a little bit more warm in tone. So, but what ended up happening is that combination of ever so slightly subtle differences alienated the audiences. And because of that, the movies of the week stopped being watched. And this was a serious problem. And by the time people realized just how serious, it was kind of too late. Didn't stop productions from going to Canada, but it meant that you had to be much more careful and make sure that if you were going to shoot something in Canada, that you took advantage of the way the lighting was. You're not going to be able to make Vancouver look at all like Southern California. You're just not. So you better set it in the Pacific Northwest, which is at least similar. And you saw these adaptations that took advantage of what Canada had to offer. But during that period, a lot of damage was done. And this goes for content as well. Canadian stories, because we had to use Canadian writers by and large. Canadian stories tended to be more chamber plays. Now, this is not to say that American TV shows weren't pictures of people talking, because they certainly were. But you tended to have much more full sets. You tended to have a lot more people just roaming around. So you had to come up with stories and other content that kind of fit the new limitations on production. And that worked too. So why am I going long on describing what happened in the past? I'm trying to do that because what Hollywood tends to try to do is when it brings something from a foreign country, it tries to make it American in too aggressive a way. And they focus on the minor points rather than the major ones. And what do I mean by that? When you look at Baby Reindeer, what is the difference, the real core difference between Baby Reindeer and Yellowstone? Because, one of them is very American. One of them is very, very British. What is the difference in the storytelling and in the enactment? Well, you'll notice that the attitudes that are within Baby Reindeer are very small. You're dealing with a very few number of people who are intimately involved with one another, and we get to know every single detail about them. We don't have a lot of room for spectacle. And what spectacle there is rather limited. And you got to remember that the entire series of Baby Reindeer probably cost less than one episode of The Acolyte. So that's a pretty big difference in the spend. So because of that, you had to make it much more about the people, and the people had to be able to sustain your interest. And one of the things that non-American shows do really well is they tend to cast among their locals, because you always have a percentage of local hires, people who look like real people. I gotta tell you, one of the beauties of Baby Reindeer is that nobody in it looks like a movie star, and that is to its advantage. Whereas when you look at most American, even serious dramas, everybody in it looks like a movie star. They look like they control every single morsel of food they eat. They look like they spend most of their lives in the gym. And they look like they spend an inordinate amount of time knowing how to catch the light and look good no matter what the circumstance. Now, this goes all the way back to the 1920s, but it is fully ingrained in the US movie star mentality that not being, but looking is what is paramount. So a lot of times when we're watching a British show or a French show, one of the things that we're getting, maybe not directly consciously, but unconsciously, is the fact that the people in it look real. Whereas when we watch an American show, we can never quite forget that most of the actors that we see in it, at least in the leads, aren't going to go home to a tenement. They're going to go home to a mansion in Bel Air. And they exude that air of that kind of high life, no matter what kind of role they're playing. And 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 this is really true, especially recently, because so much emphasis had been placed on the flying glass, no-brainer, big budget, wow 'em in the aisle spectacle, that you didn't have an opportunity to develop character actors, develop people who looked different but were still interesting. That was why it was so satisfying to see a movie like The Holdovers, which really played in that same more realistic key. Why that played so well, because it allowed actors who did not look like movie stars, even though they were Americans, to really explore that lower budget side of life. And you'll notice that most Americans eschew looking at, or most Hollywood movie making Americans eschew that look of reality. They keep wanting to make the world look not that different from what MGM used to do in the 30s, as opposed to Warner Brothers, which was trying to save money by not even building whole sets because they'd leave part of it in the dark or they wouldn't light it as well. So you couldn't see what a fake it was. And yet the MGM movies were always high key lit. It's the same general thing that's going on now, that as we're seeing Americans getting used to import shows, even if it's only a small percentage, even though it's not quite the mainstream yet, it is telling us where Hollywood should be looking to go. Because whenever you're coming out of a period of extreme bling, the next thing that comes up is usually something that's more street realistic, and usually something where you can have more natural looking people. I mean, again, going back to the transition between the 60s and the big musicals and the very last days of the full studio system to the 1970s, when you had a lot more independent film and you had a lot of the Roger Corman directors moving on to bigger productions, you also had a much greater increase in people who looked human. I mean, let's face it, Dustin Hoffman or Barbara Streisand or many of the other stars of that era, Glenda Jackson, didn't look like traditional movie stars. They looked more human. And a lot of those movies were much lower budget. And because of that much lower budget, they connected with people as being more realistic. And I think that that's where things are going. So, what are the lessons to learn from these foreign shows? If you are a creative right now, I would suggest watching as many non-US shows as possible and pay attention to the way the stories develop. Because the other thing that you'll notice, especially if you look at like a K-drama or a Japanese horror movie or something like that, you'll notice that they don't follow the three-part dramatic structure nearly as religiously as many American films do. And that has the minus point of, in certain instances, making an audience feel you're being a little bit self-indulgent because I don't see where this scene fits in with the rest of the movie. But at the same time, that extra breathing room. Now, I don't mean you make a 2.5 hour movie. I'm not telling you to make A Woman Under the Influence at all. But that little bit of extra breathing space with grace notes allows you to feel the reality of the characters. And by not having that kind of constant cutting, you are once again making it feel more like you're observing something as opposed to being manipulated into your emotions. Now, there's a challenge to doing that because a lot of times people will look at that and say, "This is a really low budget, and I'm watching an American show. I don't expect to get this kind of low budget energy." But that's okay because you're not spending a fortune. If you're spending 10 million to 20 million on a movie, you can afford for it not to be quite the same size hit that something that's huge like like Deadpool. It doesn't have to be that. Now, one of the beauties of Deadpool is it kind of had, in the midst of all of its bling, it had a lot of low budget energy to it. A lot of the banter that went on between Ryan Reynolds and Hugh Jackman was very similar to the kind of banter that used to be there in these lower budget, almost exploitational movies. And that part was very nice. It made us feel that we were connected. So I'm of the belief that look at some of these movies in the same way that American filmmakers right after World War II paid attention to the Italian neorealist movies, and that in turn inspired the New York School, which reached its real penultimate. We're not talking about Young Man with a Horn and a lot of the noir things, but look at the movies like Marty or like The Catered Affair in the middle of the eras where everything was about cinemascope and stereophonic sound and all of these big production things. You had one of the most basic kinds of movies. It almost looked like a TV show because in the case of Marty, it was the first TV show that was adapted into a feature film that actually pronounced the end of the war between television and feature film. They realized that they could coexist. It wasn't going to be one or the other, thereby opening a new window of distribution. And I'm thinking if we learn the lesson of what some of the non-American filmmakers are doing, we will be able to ride out this particular period of suddenly decreased budgets, of tightening requirements, of not feeling that it's okay to just shoot a first draft of the script and then start making script notes when you see the rough assembly. It's going back to that whole idea of that triangle of better, cheaper, faster. The maximum you can choose is 2. You might get 0. But it's time for us to look at better and cheaper as opposed to better and faster. Because better and faster has led to movies that cost $250 million. And better and cheaper has led to incredible returns on investment for some of the more minor films. And I always come back to this, like Hidden Figures, which happened to break through. I'm bullish on the future. Everyone is panicked right now, but the panic leads to innovation.
Don't you ever just want to clomp and stomp on someone, bite off their ear just to do it? I mean, just to do it, just to get it out of your system.
Come on now, don't be naive, Lieutenant. We both know how careers are made. Integrity is something you sell the public.
You sell whatever you want, but don't sell it here tonight.